Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Charles Archer. Book 2. The Mistress of Huseby. Part 2. Huseby. Chapter 1. On a day early in the new year, there came to Huseby some unlooked-for guests. They were Lavrans Bjorgelsen and old Schmidt Gudliksen from Dovre, and with them were two gentlemen whom Kristin didn't know. And Erland wondered much to see his father-in-law come in their company. They were Sir Erling Vidkundsen of Gisk and Haftor Grout of Gordoy. He had not deemed that Lavrans knew these men, but Sir Erling made things clear, telling how they had met together at Ness of Ramsdal, where he had sat with Lavrans and Smith on the Court of Six that had at last set at rest the dispute between Sir John Haukson's distant heirs. Lavrans and he had fallen into talk of Erland, and the thought came to Sir Erling that, since he had an errand to Nidaros, he would like well to wait upon the folks at Huseby, if Lavrans would join him and sail north with him. Smith Gudliksen said, laughing, that he had all but bidden himself to come along with them. For I was fain to see our Kristin again, the fairest rose of the Norddal. And then methought my kinswoman Ranfrid would be beholden to me if I kept an eye on her husband, to mark what weighty counsels he may be hatching with wise and mighty men like these. Ay, your father has other gear to guide this winter, my Kristin, than making the rounds of the manors with us, drinking out Yule till the fast comes in. Now have we sat at home on our lands in peace and quiet all these years, and looked, each man of us, to his own affairs. But now Lavrans wants us all, king's men of the Dale, to ride in a troop to Oslo at hardest midwinter. Now are we to counsel the great lords of the king's council in the best interests of the king. They are ruling things so ill for the poor boy in his nonage, says Lavrans. Sir Erling looked somewhat ill at ease. Erland raised his eyebrows. Are you of these councils, father-in-law, the calling of the great meeting of king's men? No, no, said Lavrans. I but ride to the meeting like the other king's men in the Dale, since we have been summoned thither. But Smith Gudliksen took up his tale again. 'Twas Lavrans that had talked him over, and Herstein of Crook, and Trond Giesling, and Guttorm Snice, and others that had no mind to go. Nay, but is it not your wont in these parts to bid stranger folk step into the house? Asked Lavrans. Let us see now whether Kristin can brew as good ale as her mother. Erland looked doubtfully, and Kristin wondered greatly. What is this, father? She asked a little later, when he was with her in the little hall, whither she had brought the child to be out of the stranger's way. Lavrans sat dancing his grandson on his knee. Nakvi was 10 months old now, a great child and comely. Already at Yuletide he had been put into short coats and hose. Never before, father, have I known you to put word in matters such as this, went on his daughter. I have ever heard you say that for the welfare of the land in peace and war and of his subjects 'twas best the king should take order, and the men whom he called to his side. Erland says that this venture is the work of the nobles in the south. They would set aside Lady Ingeborg and the men her father gave her for counsellors, and seize again for themselves such power as they had when King Hakon and his brother were children. But you yourself were used to say that the kingdom suffered great wrong from their rule. Lavrans whispered to her to send away the child's nurse. When they were alone, he asked, Whence came these tidings to Erland? Was it from Munin, Kristin told him that Orm had brought with him a letter from Sir Munin when he came home in the autumn. She did not tell that she herself had read it to Erland. He had no great skill in making out writing. But in the letter Munin had made bitter complaint that every man in Norway that bore arms on his shield deemed now that he understood the governing of the realm better than the men who had stood at King Haakon's side when he lived. And they held that they knew better what was for the young king's welfare than the high-born lady, his own mother. He had warned Erland that should these be signs that the Norwegian nobles had a mind to copy what the Swedes had done at Skara in the summer, hatch plots against Lady Ingeborg and her old and tried counsellors, the lady's kinsmen must hold them ready, and Erland should come south and meet Munin at Hamar. "Did he also say," said Lavrans, pushing his finger in under Nakvi's fat chin, "that I was one of the men that set their faces against the unlawful call to arms that Munin brought with him up the dale, in our king's name?" "You," said Kristin. "You met Munin Bardson in the autumn?" "I did so," answered Lavrans, "and we didn't agree very much together." "Did you speak of me?" asked Kristin quickly. "No, little Kristin," said her father, laughing a little. "I cannot call to mind that at that meeting your name came up between us. Do you know if it is so that your husband has a mind to fare south and seek out Munin Bardson?" "I believe it," said Kristin. "Sira Eilif drew up a letter for Erland not long since, and he spoke of having soon to journey south." Lavrans sat silent a little, looking at the child groping with its fingers about his dagger hilt and trying to bite the rock crystal set in it. "Is it true that they would take away the rule of the realm from Lady Ingeborg?" asked Kristin. "The lady is as old as you, or thereabouts," answered her father, still smiling a little. "None would take from the king's mother the honour or the power whereto she is born. But the archbishop and certain of the friends and kinsmen of our king that is gone have called a meeting to take counsel how the lady's power and honour and the good of the people of the land can best be guarded." Kristin said low, "I can see well, father, that you are not come to Huseby this time only to see Nakvi and me." "Not only for that," said Lavrans. Then he laughed. "And I can see, my daughter, that you like this but little." He laid one of his hands over her face and stroked it up and down. 'Twas so he had been used to do, ever since she was a little girl, whenever he had been scolding or teasing her. Meanwhile Sir Erling and Erland sat up in the armory. So was called the great storehouse that lay northeast of the courtyard, near by the main gate. It was high as a tower, having 3 stories. In the uppermost was a chamber with loopholed walls, and there were kept all the arms that were not in daily use on the manor. King Skule had built this house. Sir Erling and Erland had fur cloaks on, for it was bitter cold in the room. The guest walked about, looking at the many fair weapons and suits of armour that Erland had inherited from his mother's father, Karl Erlendsson. Erling Vidkundsen was a somewhat short man, slightly built, though a little plump, but he bore himself lightly and with grace. Fair of face he was not, though his features were well formed, but his hair was of a light reddish hue, and his eyelashes and brows were white. The eyes themselves, too, were of the palest blue. That Sir Erling was deemed, none the less, to be a well-looking man may have been because all knew he was the richest knight in Norway. But 'twas true he did have a rarely winning, quiet way with him. He was of excellent understanding, well taught, and rich in knowledge, and since he had never striven to show off his learning, but always was found ready to hearken to others, he had gotten him the name of one of the wisest men in the land. He was much the same age as Erland Nicolausson, and they were of kin to each other, though far off, through their kinship to the Stovrheim house. They had known each other long, but there had been no close friendship between the 2 men. Erland sat on a great chest, talking of the ship he had built last summer. 'Twas a 32-oar ship, and he thought she would prove a rarely swift sailor and easy steerer. He had had 2 shipwrights down from the Nordland, and had himself overseen the work along with them. "Ships are among the few things whereof I know a little, Erling," he said, "and 'twill be a fair sight to watch Margigran cleave the sea surges." "Margigran? 'Tis a fearsome heathenish name you have given your ship, kinsman," said Sir Erling, laughing a little. "You mean to sail south in her, then?" "You are as holy as my wife, I see. She too says 'tis a heathenish name." "Ah, she doesn't like the ship either. But she is inland bred. She can't endure the sea." "Aye, she seems right holy and fine and gracious, your lady," said Sir Erling courteously. "As one might look she should be, seeing the kindred she comes of." "Aye," Erling laughed a little. "Not a day goes by when she doesn't go to Mass. And Sira Eilif, our priest whom you saw, reads aloud for us from godly books. 'Tis what he likes best, next to ale and dainty dishes, to read aloud. And poor folk come hither to Kristin for counsel and help. They would be fain to kiss the hem of her garment, I well believe. I hardly know my men any more. She is likest one of the ladies of whom there is record in the holy sagas that King Hakon forced us to sit and hear the priest read aloud. Do you remember, when we were pages together? Much is changed at Huseby since last you were my guest, Erling. I marvel indeed that you would come to me as things were then," he said a little after. "You spoke of the time when we were pages together," said Erling Vidkundsen with a smile that became him well. "We were friends then, were we not? In those days, all of us, Erland, we thought that you would go far in this land of ours." But Erland only laughed. "Yeah, I thought so too." "Can you not sail southward along with me, Erland?" said Sir Erling. "My purpose is to journey by land," answered the other. "A toilsome journey for you over the mountains in midwinter," said Sir Erling. "'Twould be pleasant if you would bear Hafthor and me company." "I have given my promise to certain other folks to go with them," answered Erland. "Doubtless you go along with your father-in-law." "Ah, yes, that is but reason." "No, not so. I know so little of these men from the dale he used to ride with." Erland sat silent a while. "No, I have promised to look in on Munin at Stang," he brought out hurriedly. "You can spare yourself the pains," answered the other. "Munin is gone down to his estates in Hising, and it may well be that 'twill be long ere he comes north again. Is it long since you heard from him?" "'Twas at Michaelmastide. He wrote to me from Ringabu." "Aye, but do you know what befell in the Dale this last autumn?" asked Erling. "You don't know? Sure you must know. He rode round himself to the wardens, all about Majots and up the Dale, with letters bearing that the farmers should bring forth full levies of horses and supplies, 1 horse to every 6 farmers, and the nobles and freeholders should send horses, but might stay at home themselves. Have you not heard of this? And that the men of the Northern Dale denied to furnish this levy when Munin came with Eric Top to the thing at Varg? Moreover, 'twas Lavransdatter that led the opposers. He challenged Eirik, if there was anything outstanding from the lawful levies, to gather it in lawful wise. He called it high-handed oppression on the people to crave war taxes from the farmers, only to help a Danish man to wage war on the Danish king. And should our king call for service from his king's men, said Lavrans, he should find them ready enough to come to tryst with good weapons and horses and men-at-arms. But he wouldn't send from Jorengard so much as a he-goat and a hempen halter, except the king craved he should ride it himself to the muster. Nay, now surely you know this. Smith Gudligson says that Lavrans promised his farmers he would pay their levy fines for them, if need should be. Erland sat in wonderment. Never have I heard before that my wife's father meddled in anything but what might touch his own estates or his friends. 'Tis not often he does so, like enough, said Sir Erling. But so much I could see, when I was at Ness with him, that when Lavrans Bjorgelson speaks his mind in a matter, he lacks not followers in plenty. For he speaks not except he know the business so well that his word can hardly be overthrown. Now, touching these supplies, 'tis said he has changed letters with his kin in Sweden. As you know, Lady Ramborg, his father's mother, and Sir Ern Giesel's grandfather were cousins, so that his kinsfolk there are many and worshipful. Quiet a man as he is, your father-in-law, he has no little power in the countryside where folks know him, though he doesn't use it often. Aye, then I do understand why you seek his company, Erling, said Erland, laughing. I marvel that you were grown such hot friends. Marvel you at that? Asked Erling, unmoved. A strange man must be he that would not be fain to call Lavrans of Jorengard his friend. You, kinsman, would serve your turn better by hearkening to him than to Munin. Munin has been like an elder brother to me ever since the day I first went forth from my home, said Erland a little hotly. Never did he fail me when the pinch came, and if now a pinch be come for him, Munin will be safe enough, said Erling Vidkundsen, calmly as before. The letters he bore around were sealed with the great seal of Norway. Unlawfully, but that doesn't touch him. True, there is more, that which he was privy to and attested with his seal when he was witness to the Lady Euphemia's betrothal, but that can scarce be brought to light without touching one whom we would not. Truth to tell, Erland, I think Munin can save his own skin without your help, but you may harm yourself. 'Tis the Lady Ingeborg you aim at, I see well, said Erland. I have promised our kinswoman to serve her, both here and in foreign lands. And even so have I promised, answered Erling, and I mean to keep that promise. And so, I think, does every Norseman that served and loved our lord and kinsman King Hakon. And the best service that can be shown her is to part her from those counsellors who counsel so young a lady to her own hurt and her son's. Believe you, asked Erland in a low voice, that you can achieve that? Aye, said Erling Vidkundsen firmly, I do believe it. And I think all believe it, who don't listen to, he shrugged his shoulders, evil-minded and loose talk. And that should we, the lady's kinsmen, be the last of all to do. A serving-maid lifted the trapdoor in the floor, and asked if it would suit them now that the mistress have the supper borne into the hall. While the hostfolk was still at the board, the talk ever and anon kept glancing toward these weighty matters that were in question. Kristin marked that both her father and Sir Erling tried to hinder this. They turned the talk with news of wedding bargains and deaths, strife among heirs and dealings in farms. She was uneasy, though she scarce herself knew why. They had some errand of weight to Erland, she could see, and though she would not own it to herself, she knew her husband so well now as to feel that, headstrong as he was, he might mayhap easily enough be turned aside by one who had a firm hand in a soft glove, as the saying went. After the meal the men moved over to the hearth and sat there drinking. Kristin settled down on the bench, took her broidery frame into her lap, and began plaiting the fringes. Soon after, Hafthor Grout came across to her, laid a cushion on the floor and sat on it at her feet. He had found Erland's cithern, and he held it on his knee and sat thrumming on it and prattling. Hafthor was a quite young man, with yellow ringleted hair, most comely of face, but freckled beyond measure. Kristin soon marked that he was a most heedless talker. He had but just wedded richly, but he had grown weary at home on his estates, he said. 'Twas therefore he was going now to the meeting of the king's men. But 'tis no more than reason that Erla Nikolausen bide at home, he said, and laid his head back on Kristin's lap. She drew a little aside, laughed, and said, if she mistook not, her husband too was minded to journey south, whatever the cause may be, she said with an air of innocence. There is so much unrest in the land these days, 'tis no easy thing for a simple woman to judge of such things. Yet 'tis a woman's simplicity that is most to blame for it, answered Hafthor, laughing and shifting nearer again. Aye, so at least say Erling and Lavransdatter. I would be fain to know what they mean by it. What think you, Mistress Kristin? Lady Ingeborg is a good, simple woman. Maybe she is sitting now even as you are, plaiting silk with her snow-white fingers and thinking, hard-hearted would it be to deny her departed husband's trusty vassal a little matter of help toward bettering his fortunes. Erland came over and sat by his wife. Hafthor had to move a little to make room. "'Tis such trumpery tales the dames hatch out in their lodging when their husbands are fools enough to take them with them to the assemblies." "Folks say where I am from," said Hafthor, "that there is no smoke without fire." "Aye, we have that byword too," said Lavrans. He and Erling had joined them. "And yet was I cheated, Hafthor, last winter, when I would have lit my lantern with a piece of fresh horse dung." He sat himself down on the edge of the table. Straightway Sir Erling fetched Lavran's beaker across and proffered it to him with a bow, then sat down near him on the bench. "'Tis not possible, Hafthor," said Erland, "that you can know, away north in Helagoland, what Lady Ingeborg and her counsellors know of the purposes and undertakings of the Danes. I know not if you were not short-sighted when you set yourself up against the king's call for help. Sir Nut, aye, we may as well call him by his name. 'Tis he we all have in our thoughts. He seemed not to me the man to let himself be caught, dozing on his perch. You folk dwell too far away from the great cauldrons to smell what is cooking in them. Better to be prepared now than regret later, say I." "Aye," said Sir Erling. "Almost a man might say they cook for us now in our neighbours' manner. Soon will we Norsemen be most like folk living on a pittance from their heirs. They send us in at the door the porridge they have cooked in Sweden. Eat it if you would have meat. I think it was an error of our lord King Hakon that, as it were, he moved the kitchen to an outskirt of the farm when he made Oslo the first city of the land. Before it lay midway of the farm place, if we may keep to this way of speech, Bjorgvin or Nidaros. But now there is none to rule in these parts but the archbishop and chapter. Aye, what do you say, Erland, you that are a Tronder, with all your goods and all your lordship in Trondheim here?" "Aye, God's blood, Erling, is that what you would be at? To carry home the pot and hang it up at the right hearthstone once again?" "Aye," said Hafthor, "all too long have we here in the north had to be content with a smell of singeing and a gulp of cold broth." Lavrans broke in. "Thus it stands, Erland. I had not taken it on me to be spokesman for the folk of our countryside at home, but that I had in my keeping letters from my kinsman Sir Erngisel. So I knew that none of the men who bear rightful rule either in the Dane kings or in our king's realms have any thought of breaking the peace and friendship between our lands." "If you know who bears rule in Denmark now, father-in-law, I think you know more than do most other men," said Erland. "One thing I do know," said Lavrans. "There is one man whom none would see bear rule either here nor in Sweden nor in Denmark. And that was the drift of the Swedes' doing at Skara last summer, and that is the drift of the meeting we would now hold in Oslo, to make clear to all who have not yet understood it that on this all prudent men are at one." By now they had all drunk so much that they were grown somewhat loud-voiced, all but old Smid Gudligson, who sat nodding in his chair by the hearth. Erland cried out, "Ah, you folks are so prudent that the devil himself cannot trick you. 'Tis no marvel you would be afraid of Nut Pors. You cannot understand him, you good gentry. He's not the man to be content to sit mum chance watching the days slip by and the grass grow as God wills it. Fain would I be to meet that knight again. I knew him when I was at Halland, and nothing would I have against it if I stood in Nut Pors's shoes." "I wouldn't have said so much where my wife could hear me," said Hafthor Grout. But Erling Vidkundsen too was now well on in drink. He tried to keep a hold on his courtly ways, but they slipped from his grasp. "You," said he, bursting into great laughter. "You, kinsman? Nay, Erland." He slapped the other on the shoulder and laughed and laughed. "Nay, Erland," said Lavrans bluntly. "There needs more for that than beguiling of fair ladies. Were there nothing more in Nutpors than that he can play the fox in the goose-pen, I think we gentlefolk of Norway were all too slothful to turn out of our houses to hunt him off, even were the goose our king's mother. But whomsoever Sir Nut can beguile to play the fool for his sake, he himself plays no tricks that have not a meaning in them. He has his goal, and be sure he takes not his eyes from it." There was a pause in the talk. Then Erland said, his eyes glittering, "Then I would that Sir Nut were a Norseman." The others sat silent a little. Sir Erling took a draught from his goblet, then said, "God forbid! Was there such a man among us here in Norway, I fear me there would quickly be an end of peace in the land." "Peace in the land?" said Erland scornfully. "Yes, peace in the land," answered Erling Vidkundsen. "Bear in mind, Erland, 'tis not we of the knighthood alone that own this land and live in it. To you would mayhap seem sport if there should arise here a man greedy of adventure and of power like Nutpors. So it was in bygone days that when a man raised revolt in this our land, 'twas easy for him to find followers from among the nobles. Either they would gain the upper hand and win titles and fiefs, or their kinsmen won, and they were given grace for life and goods. Aye, the record tells who lost their lives, but the more part saved their skins whether things went so or so. The more part of our fathers, mark you. But the mass of the common farmers and the townsmen, Erland, the working folk that many a time had their dues wrung from them twice over in 1 year, and might be joyful, moreover, each time a troop had passed through the countryside without burning their farms and slaughtering their cattle, the common folk that had to suffer such unbearable burdens and oppression, they, I think, thank God and St. Olaf or old King Hakon and King Magnus and his sons, who strengthened the laws and made the peace sure. Ah, I well believe that you believe 'tis so." Erland threw back his head. Lavrans sat looking at the younger man. He was wide awake now, was Erland. His dark, vehement countenance was flushed red. His throat seemed to swell into an arch in the slender brown neck. Then Lavrans looked at his daughter. Kristin had let her work fall on her lap and was following the men's talk intently. "Are you so sure that the peasants and the common folk think thus, and praise so much the new order of things?" said Erland scornfully. "'Tis true they had hard times often, in the old days when kings and rival kings warred with each other through all the land. I know that they still remember the time when they must take often to the hills with cattle and wives and children, while their farms went up in flames all down the valleys. I have heard them speak of it. But I know that they remember something else as well, that their own fathers were in the armies. Not we alone played for power, Erling. The peasant's son played too, and time and again they won our lands from us. 'Tis not when law rules in a land that the son of a Skidan trull that knows not his own father's name wins a baron's widow with her lands and goods, as did Ryder Dar. You deemed a son of his house a good enough match for your daughter, Lavrans, and now hath he wedded your lady's niece, Erling. But now law and justice rule, and, I know not how it comes, but I know it is so, the peasant's land comes into our hands more and more, and that with the law. The more law and right rule, the quicker it goes, the quicker their power in the kingdom's affairs and their own slips from their hands. And, Erling, the common farmers know it too. Oh, no, don't be so sure, good sirs, that the common folk have no yearnings back to that time when they might lose their farms by fire and by rapine, but they might also win by arms more than they can win by law." Lavrans nodded. "There is some truth in what Erland says," he said in a low voice. But Erling Vidkundsen rose. "I can well believe it. that the common folk remember better the few men that rose from nothing and came to might and mastery in the time of the sword, than the numberless men that went under in black poverty and misery. And yet none were harder masters to the smaller folks than these first. I think 'tis of them the byword was first made, none more unkind than kin. If a man be not born to mastery, he is ever a hard master. But if he have grown up in childhood amid serving men and serving women, 'tis far easier for him to understand that without the common folk we are in many a wise as helpless as children in all our days, and that, not only for the love of God, but quite as much for our own sake, we should serve them on our part with our knowledge, and guard them with our knighthood. Never yet has a kingdom stood, except there were in it great men with the strength and the will to use their power to make sure the lesser folks' rights. "You could preach against my brother for a wager, Erling," said Erland, laughing. "But my belief is that these Subbentronders liked us great folk better in the old days, when we led their sons to battle and foray, let our blood flow out over the deck-planks mixed with theirs, and hewed rings in sunder and shared the booty with our housecarls. Aye, you see, Kristin, sometimes I sleep with one ear open when Sarah Eilif reads from his great books." "Goods that are won in that way do not come down to the third air," said Lavransdatter. "Have you not heard this, Erland?" "Surely I have heard it," Erland laughed aloud. "But seen it I have not." Erling Vidkundsen said, "So it is, Erland, that few are born to be masters, but all are born to serve. The right lord is the servant of his servants." Erland clasped his hands together behind his neck and stretched himself, smiling. "On that I have never thought, and I don't think that my tenants have any service to thank me for. And yet, strange though it be, I think they like me well." He rubbed his cheek against Kristin's black kitten, which had sprung up on his shoulder and now, arching his back, was walking, purring round his neck. "But my wife here, she is the most serviceable of ladies to all, though in faith you have no cause to believe it, for our cans and flagons are empty, Kristin mine." Orm, who had sat silent, following the men's talk, got up at once and went out. "The lady grew so weary she fell asleep," said Haftor, smiling, "and the fault is ours. 'Twere liker you had left her in peace to speak to someone like me that has the wit to know how to talk to ladies." "Yes, this talk has run on for you too long, I fear, mistress," began Sir Erling in excuse. But Kristin answered with a smile, "So indeed it is, sir, that I have not understood all that has been said here tonight. But I bear it well in mind, and I shall have good time to think over it hereafter." Orm came back with some maids bearing in more liquor. He went round filling the cups. Lavrans looked sorrowfully at the comely boy. He had tried to have some speech with Orm Erlendsson, but the boy was of few words, though his bearing was mannerly and courteous. One of the maids whispered to Kristin that Nakvi was awake down in the little hall and was screaming terribly. On this the lady of the house bade her guests good night and left the hall with her maids. The men turned to the ale cup again. Sir Erling and Lavrans changed glances now and again, and at last the knight said, "There is a matter, Erland, that I had a mind to speak of with you. 'Tis sure that a levy of ships will be called out from the lands around the fjord here and from more. Folks in the north dread that the Russians will come again in strength in the summer, and that without help they will not be strong enough to guard the land. This Russian feud is the first profit we have drawn from our sharing a king with Sweden. 'Twould not be just that the Halagolanders should be left to enjoy it alone. Now it so falls out that Arnjvaldsen is too old and sickly, and there has been talk of naming you as chief of all the ships from this side of the fjord. How would you like that?" Erland smote one fist into the palm of the other hand. His whole face shone. "How would I like it?" "'Twill scarce be possible to raise any great force," said Erling, as though to sober him. "But we thought that, if you will, 'twere well you should set things in train with the wardens round about. You know all this country well, and 'twas said among the lords of the council that perhaps you were the man best fitted to make somewhat of this matter. There are they that still remember that you won no small honour when you were warden of the Halland coast under Count Jacob. I remember myself that I heard him say to King Hakon he had been unwise to deal so harshly with a likely young fellow. He said there was the stuff in you for a trusty servant to your king." Erland snapped his fingers. "No, don't tell me that you are to be our king, Erling Vidkundsen. Is this the plot you are hatching?" he said, laughing loudly. "To make Erling king?" Erling said testily, "No, Erland, don't you see I speak now in all sadness?" "God help us, were you jesting before then? Methought you had spoken in sadness enough all the night." "Ah, all right, let us speak in sadness then, kingsman. Tell me all concerning this affair." Kristin lay sleeping with the child by her breast when Erland came down to the little hall. He lit a fir-root brand at the embers on the hearth and looked at the two for a little while by its light. So fair she was, and a fair child was he too, their son. She was always so sleepy in the evenings now, Kristin. The moment she had lain her down and drawn her child close to her, both of them fell asleep. Erland laughed a little and threw the stick back onto the hearth. Slowly he drew off his garments. Northward in the spring, with Margeigren and 3 or 4 warships. Hafthor Grout with 3 ships from Halagoland. But Hafthor was new and untried in such work. Him 'twas like he could manage as seemed good to him. Aye, he well saw he could have things as he would up there. For this Hafthor looked not as though he were a coward or half-hearted. Erland stretched himself out and smiled in the dark. He had thought to raise a crew for Margeigren from Moor outside the fjord, but both this countryside and Bergsea swarmed with stout, bold young fellows. The finest choice of men was his. Not much more than a year since he was wedded. Childbearing, penance and fasting, and now the boy first and the boy last, both day and night. Yet she was the same young, sweet Kristin, when he could get her to forget the prating priests and her greedy suckling for a little while. He kissed her shoulder, but she marked it not. Poor child, let her sleep, and he had so much to think on tonight. Erland turned away from her and gazed out into the room at the little glowing spark on the hearth. Perhaps he should get up and cover up the embers, but he had no mind to. Memories of his youth came in shreds and snatches. A quivering ship's stem standing as 'twere waiting a second for the oncoming wave, and the sea that came washing inboard. The mighty clamour of storms and waves. The whole vessel groaned in the press of the seas. The masthead cut its wild curve on the flying clouds. 'Twas somewhere off the Halland coast. Erland lay overwhelmed, feeling the tears fill his eyes. He had not known himself how these years of idleness had irked him. The next morning Lavrans Bjorgelsen and Sir Erling stood at the upper end of the courtyard, looking at some of Erland's horses that ran loose outside the fence. "Methinks," said Lavrans, "should Erland appear in this assembly, such rank and birth are his, since he is kinsman to the king and the king's mother, that he must needs come forth among the foremost. Now I don't know, Sir Erling, whether you think you can be sure that his judgment in these affairs will not rather lead him to the other side. If Ivar Ogmundsson should try a counter-move, Erland has near ties too with the men who will follow Sir Ivar." "I have little thought that Sir Ivar will do anything," said Erling Vidkundsen. "And Bunen," his lip curled a little, "he will be wise enough, I think, to stay away. He knows that else it might well be made clear to all men how much or how little Bunen Bardson counts for." They both laughed. "And there is this to be thought on. Aye, you know better than I, Lavrans Lagmanson, you who have kith and kin there, that the Swedish lords are loath to count our knighthood as the equals of theirs. It might seem needful, then, that we should let no man be lacking from among those we have, richest and of highest birth. We can ill afford to let a man like Erland have leave to sit at home, dallying with his wife and tending his farms, tend he them well or ill, he added as he saw Lavrans look. Lavrans smiled slightly. But should you think it unwise to press Erland to come with us, I will let it be. I think, dear sir, said Lavrans, that Erland would do better service here in his own country. As you said yourself, we look for no goodwill toward this levy in the parishes in the south, whose folk deem they have nothing to fear from the Russians. It might be that Erland would be the very man to change folks' thoughts of the matter in some measure. He hath such a cursed loose tongue, Sir Erling burst out. Lavrans answered with a little smile. Maybe his kind of talk will be understood by many better than, more clear-headed people's speech. They looked at each other again and both laughed. Howsoever that may be, he could sure do greater hurt should he go to the meeting and talk too loudly there. Ay, if so be that you cannot stay him. That can I never do, once when he meets with birds of the flock he has been wont to fly with. My son-in-law and I are too unlike. Erland came up to them. Have you had so much profit of the mass that you have no need of breakfast? I heard nothing of breakfast. I am hollow as a wolf and thirsty. Lavrans caressed a dirty white horse he had been handling as he stood there. The man that tends your farm horses, son-in-law, I would drive off the place before I sat down to table, were he my man. I dare not, for fear of Kristin, said Erland. One of her maids is with child by him. Nay, do you count that so great a deed in this countryside, said Lavrans, raising his eyebrows a little, that you think, because of it, you cannot do without him? No, but see you, said Erland, laughing. Kristin and the priest will have them wed, and they will have me put him in the way of earning a living for himself and her. The girl would not, and her guardian would not, and Tor himself is none too willing. But they will not let me turn him out. She fears he would fly the parish. Then, too, there is Ulf Halldorsen to oversee him, when Ulf is at home. Erling Vidkundsen went to meet Smit Gudligsen. Lavrans said to his son-in-law, Methinks Kristin looks somewhat pale in the daytime. Ay, said Erland eagerly. Can you not speak to her, father-in-law? That boy of hers is sucking the very marrow out of her. I think she will keep him at the breast till the third fast comes round, like any Kotar woman. Ah, she loves her son very much, said Lavrans. Yeah, Erland shook his head. They will sit for 3 hours, she and Syra Eilif, and talk of it, should a little rash show on him here or there. And for every tooth he cuts, it seems to them a great miracle has come to pass. I have never known anything else but that children were apt to cut teeth, and I think it would be a greater marvel if our Nakvi had had none.